Well, good afternoon. Is this working? Good afternoon. Did you have a good lunch? And did you have a good morning? Good. Well, for those of you that may not have been here at the very beginning of the day, my name is Paul Maurer. I'm president of Montreat College. We're delighted to have you here today, and we've got a tremendous plenary panel planned for you this afternoon. I'm going to introduce our three panelists here momentarily. The topic of this panel is the impact of cybercrime on small and mid-sized businesses and local and regional governments. I referenced earlier this morning a Charlotte Business Journal cover of their journal this summer that was entitled "Small is Not Safe," and highlighted the reality that small and mid-sized organizations are increasingly the targets of cyber attack. You may have seen an article in the New York Times several weeks ago. 40-some cities this year alone have been shut down by malware attacks, and 22, for some reason, there was a focus of 22 of those cities in the state of Texas this summer that were shut down. And these malware attacks, these cyber attacks, bring these municipalities to their knees. The Atlanta hack of last summer brought the city of Atlanta to its knees, paper and pencil, for a number of days, perhaps weeks. I don't remember the exact length. And they chose not to pay the ransom. And to date, that breach has cost the city of Atlanta at least an estimated $17 million. And so small and mid-sized organizations are increasingly the focus of cyber attacks. Our panelists, beginning on the far end, are Keith Gordon, the Chief Information Security Officer of Ally Financial. Keith is responsible for strategy, innovation, and security architecture, data security and third-party supplier security, cyber analytics, user behavior analytics for information security, as well as enterprise disaster recovery and business continuity. Keith was with Bank of America prior to coming to Ally, where he took on a number of roles. I won't get into the details of that. He left Bank of America in 2012 to take on a role as Enterprise Information Security and IT Risk Management at Capital One. He's a graduate of Anderson University in Indiana with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Marketing and Mathematics. He is active on the board. He is an active board member for the National Cyber Awareness Alliance and the Anti-Phishing Working Group. Keith and his family live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Keith Gordon. Next to Keith is Lieutenant General Bill Bender, who was the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. Air Force. He is now a strategic account executive overseeing government relations for Leidos. He is responsible for strengthening and advancing trusted relationships with customers and advancing strategic initiatives to foster organic growth. General Bender has more than 34 years of military experience and executive-level leadership in multiple facets of information technology and government services. He was the CIO for the U.S. Air Force, responsible for 50,000 cyber operations and support personnel across the world, with oversight for the Air Force's IT investment strategy and a portfolio valued at $17 billion. General Bender was the second highest ranking military officer based at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, serving as the Deputy Chief, Office of Security Cooperation, Iraq, with oversight and management of foreign military sales and security cooperation initiatives supporting U.S. diplomatic relations with the government of Iraq. His leadership tenure at the Air Force included serving as COO with overall operations, training in IT, cybersecurity, and government services. He earned his Bachelor's of Engineering in Electrical Engineering from Manhattan College. He also holds a Master of Arts in National Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College, an MBA in Business and Aviation from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and numerous certificates from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming General Bill Bender. And then last but not least, on my immediate left is Paul Connelly, who's the Vice President of Information Protection Security and the Chief Information Security Officer for HCA Healthcare. Paul is responsible for information protection at HCA's 179 hospitals, over 1,000 other patient care centers and corporate headquarters. Paul is HCA's executive for HIPAA security rule, payment card industry, GDPR compliance, and leads 175 specialists in information security, privacy, physical security, and information lifecycle management. Prior to HCA, Paul worked as an information security analyst at the National Security Agency. He was also the Chief Information Security Officer at the White House Communications Agency, where he served under Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton as the first CISO at the White House. He also spent time as a partner leading an information security consulting practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was inducted into the White House Communication Agency Hall of Fame in 1998. He also won the Award for Information Security Achievement in the Federal Government in 1992 and the Information Security Executive of the Year Award for Private Sector in North America in 2009. 22 members of Paul's teams have been hired as Chief Information Security Officers at other organizations. He's a graduate of the Naval War College National Security Study Program, has bachelor's and master's degrees in resource economics from the University of Florida, and is part of the Leadership Nashville class of 2018. He holds certificates as an information systems security professional and the National Security Agency's information systems security professional. He's a member of the board of directors for Dismas House, a Nashville not-for-profit supporting men returning from incarceration. Please join me in welcoming Paul Connelly. So I've been very excited about this panel because, as you can tell, we've got three really underachieving human beings. These guys have done what most humans don't dream of doing, and so we've got them here. And Paul, I'm going to start with you. Stats continue to point to insiders being the significant source of risk. Estimates are, 50, 60, 70% have an insider, breaches have some sort of an insider component to them. How do you walk the fine line between controls to manage risk and being an being an obstacle to innovation for business?
It's one of the biggest challenges I think we face in this field. And when I talk about insider risk, I'm not just thinking about malicious people. The bigger part of the problem are well-intentioned people who are just trying to get something done quickly, and they're trying to be expedient, and they either are ignorant of a rule or they bypass something and they create a hole or a back door. So we refer to it in our group as, we worry about the death by 1,000 cuts coming from within. And I'm in a healthcare organization, healthcare provider, so it's especially important for us that we don't put rules out there that are going to become obstacles to doctors and nurses who are trying to take care of people in hospital beds. So it's a huge challenge, and I think the key is collaborating with the end user and not being a security group that sits back in a tower and puts out these edicts. You've got to get out there and understand how, whatever your business is, whatever your organization does, get out there and understand how the operations work, and then how do you knit together what you're trying to accomplish security-wise with what they're trying to accomplish operationally.
So whether you're a small organization or a large organization or something in between, the larger you get, the more points of risk there are. So you've got hundreds of people potentially in an organization that are the vulnerable point, the weak link. How do you mitigate in an environment where you have increasing points of potential risk?
I think I notice in the agenda following this, there's a session about culture, and I would say culture is such a huge factor. I think when people think about cybersecurity especially, they tend to immediately jump to technology and what tools are you using, but No matter what your technology is, it can be compromised if you don't have the right culture. And it's constant awareness. It's, we think in terms of make people aware of what the risks are, let them know what the approach is that we want to follow, and then hold them accountable for following that approach. So that's just kind of the whatever size, whatever type organization you have, I think that critical first step is establishing that kind of culture.
I should mention now that the format of this session is that I've got a series of questions that I'll be asking all three of our panelists, but we want to invite your questions as well. And so if we can go ahead and maybe flash up on the Q&A, you can text your questions to the number up on the screen, and they will just accumulate, and I'll see them on my phone here, and we'll entertain your questions as well. So as you listen to these panelists, feel free to text in your questions. So Paul, let me come back to you again. So how does your program structured at your organization, where does it report, and what is within your scope? How closely do you work with privacy, DR, BCP, and physical security?
We actually bring all those together. We're a little bit unusual. Usually, the larger your organization gets, oftentimes the more siloed and sort of specialists you develop specialty areas. The approach that we've taken is we actually have cybersecurity, physical security, privacy, data retention. We have them all together in one organization, and our thought is that that's a model where even though privacy and physical security are very different, there's overlaps. They both involve getting out, doing assessments, following policies, awareness. So we try to look for the synergies between those programs as part of the approach that we take. And I actually think, getting to the topic of small and medium-sized businesses, I think one of the challenges that they face is scarce resources. And I think taking advantage of synergies, making sure that you're lining up similar activities so that you make the most of each time. We went this way because we want to limit the number of times that we're walking around in hospitals doing inspections or audits or whatever word you want to use, assessments. So by pulling them all together, at the same time we're looking for privacy issues, we're looking for physical security, we're looking for cyber issues. And so I think that's an approach that has been effective. I've got 5 of my colleagues here that I keep looking to see if they're like, no, don't go there. So I think they agree. They're, the way our company is structured, we have, you said 179, we're actually up to 184 hospitals. But they work as small businesses. We also have software development companies that were startups that we purchased that continue to work as small companies. So that we find that approach works from the big HCA healthcare level, but also works at the individual hospital or business level.
Very good. General Bender, let me turn to you. You've worked in now private sector, but most of your time in the military. The cyber environment is complex, it's changing rapidly, it's changing every day. The threats are evolving on a regular basis, as are the threat actors. What would you like to share in terms of a defensive strategy and vision for implementing and addressing the weaknesses inherent in our current defensive measures and cybersecurity service provider methods, techniques, and procedures?
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for having me today and for the opportunity to participate in this conference. I think maybe first I'd start with, I can reflect both on the Air Force and a long, sort of tenure as the CIO, but then benchmark it on what I'm doing today and what I see in industry. And I think the number one takeaway there is we're kind of all working on the same thing. And to the some of the discussion that you've already had with Paul, when I look at Leidos as a very large, in fact, the largest provider of information technology to the federal government across the entire government, and yet not really having a foothold or a direct interest in state and local governments, that really is not, it's not an important fact because we're actually all very much doing the same thing. So to Paul's hospital examples, Leidos has a large, for example, business in electronic health records in hospitals, and it's incumbent on us then to consider the very same sort of principles and considerations around securing privacy and defending that the privacy in the hospital range, but also for the Department of Defense, for all of the intel community, as well as some of our civil federal agencies. So I'm trying to connect the dots between a very large federal government and some of the same issues and concerns that cascade down to state and local and to small and medium-sized business. In terms of defending, it was an area that, as the CIO for the Air Force, was probably my larger concern. We all wanted to disappear to a secure facility and worry about offensive cyber operations, but 99% of the problem was actually in defending, in my case, the Air Force enterprise, which, if you just take one measure, was 750,000 endpoints in a global laydown, and so it was a large undertaking. And at each one of those endpoints was basically the common denominator, as Paul mentioned earlier, people. And so far and away, my efforts were in areas of training, cultural mindset shift, recognizing the importance of the weakest link to any set of enterprises, and much less about the technology that we would use. As it came to technology, I think we worked very hard on lowering our cybersecurity footprint, and so it was driving us in a direction of fewer tools, an integrated platform approach to security, which we felt was fighting against the way we had acquired and procured for many, many years. And so a lot of the effort was to convince people of the need to change your mindset around how you would procure cybersecurity solutions writ large. So a lot to unpack in there, but I think the important point is at least a perspective from government and then in industry is that we're really very much all working on the same thing. So the conditions are set then to share, to communicate, to take lessons learned, and to borrow from one another.
Let's talk for a second about gaps in cyber defense. If we turn our attention to what are the gaps, where are the seams of weakness in cyber defense, what are the things that you think we ought to be thinking about?
Well, I think my own experience had been that it tends to be, I mentioned the weakest link, setting aside people who have not been trained and are not always, fully conversant on the dangers that reside in their behaviors around cybersecurity. I think that one of the biggest challenges we faced was just a plethora of tools, and the idea was you're chasing the next shiny object around defending your infrastructure. The truth was that it was really trying to find a best-in-class and integrated approach to that, and so sort of painting a mosaic of your security requirements and really thinking in terms of an iterative platform approach to a better, sort of design or solution set around the architecture you put in place. And so the gaps were real, associated primarily with, a would-be adversary's ability to penetrate your infrastructure based on just too many tools, too much to protect, too much to defend across the enterprise, and it just became so complex that it was nearly an impossible task. So a lot of my time as a CIO was educating people and then taking tools away.
So you spent a large portion of your career in military and government. You're now in private industry. Love for you to share your thoughts and insights about the concept of these public-private partnerships and the cross-organizational entities working together, academia, business, government, working together to solve these problems. This is, of course, the concept of the Carolina Cyber Center as a public-private partnership. What comments would you have about the need for these different segments of society to work together and how that might be facilitated?
Well, after 3 years as the CIO of the Air Force, and as I reflected on what that experience was, I think that the point that I felt was most important to make and tried to be as public as I possibly could was on this whole notion of public-private partnership, and specifically government and industry and academia coming together. We could spend the remaining time having this discussion as to why that has developed over time, but the fact of the matter is that in the case of the federal government, and I'm quite sure at the state and the local level, they simply do not have the trained workforce. They do not have the dollars and the funds required to address the scope of the problem. And at least in the case of the United States Air Force, which I think is representative of the other services across the department and even the entire federal government, we had not invested in the research and development. In fact, in about a 15 to 20 year period, the complete change of the dynamic where we were investing a tremendous amount of money in developing new technologies, and others would come after and try to find commercial applications. Now most of the R&D sits in the commercial sector, and so some of the very best technology development efforts and the solutions that are out there do not reside within the government, and they have to go ask for it. Only their cultural mindset is they're not used to asking for anything. And in fact, there's a whole trove of lawyers and contractors and acquisition people that will keep you from meeting with commercial because all of the rules were written in the case of the Air Force in 1947. And so there are a lot of hurdles and barriers to that relationship, and yet it's very clear to me that in industry sits a lot of capital ready to spend on solving these problems. What they lack is a government customer able to access it and willing to sit down at the various earliest stages and sort of problem set together. And so it's a change of the way that organizations work together that is required. And I'm very excited at what's going on here at Montreat, because I think you've shown vision and leadership in a way that pulls the third part of that trifecta together, for lack of a better word, and working with industry and government to actually solve big problems that alone nobody actually has the resources or the talent to solve. So,
thanks for the commercial, appreciate it. Keith, let me turn to you, CISO at Ally Bank, formerly Bank of America. We talk a lot here about the human factor, but the reality is that artificial intelligence and machine learning are really a very significant factor. Talk about how they are changing and how they're being used to defend in cyber attacks.
So I'll think about it from a couple of different perspectives. One is as what do we do to protect our company? So we talked about insiders a bit ago. From a behavior perspective, we have implemented some capability where we can watch behavior of people as they do their normal work, so that we can understand kind of what's normal behavior, but then most importantly, it'll start to, over time, begin to identify what's abnormal behavior. And that's going to be learned. So as you think about how is an environment going to learn behavior, it's based upon a lot of data. So data has become a key part of our program, and how much we can aggregate together and then throw, I hate to use tools, but some tools on top of it to really go out and understand what's the risk of our organization. So as an example, if you've got a developer that all they do is develop, they're in this environment every single day, traditionally they're there about 8 to 5, rough time frame, but then all of a sudden they pop up on our network at 2 o'clock in the morning. And maybe they're not working at home, maybe they're actually in the office because we also captured their badge swipe that they came into the office. That's abnormal. That type of learning and behavior analysis is going to be critical for me to not only protect my network, but also protect our physical structures too, so that we could then leverage intelligence that's being gathered at the technology layer to understand the risks. From a customer perspective, as we think about our customers coming to interact with us, I obviously want to make it easier. I want to remove roadblocks for our customers to be able to come do business with us, to authenticate at ally.com if you're a banking customer of ours. So as you think about how can I leverage new behavior, the term that we use is behavior biometrics. So how do you interact with us as a customer on a daily basis? Do you normally come in over your phone? How do you hold your phone? Do you hold it vertically? Do you hold it horizontally? What's the angle that you use? What's your typing cadence? What's the IP address that you normally come from? What's the range? What's the area that you normally do business with us? What are your traditional transactions that you do with us? We're leveraging, again, data, a lot of data, to determine the riskiness of that particular interaction we have with you. So ultimately, where I'd like to go is where passwords are just not even used anymore, so that we can move to a passwordless environment based upon knowing who you are and the behavior that we have historically seen from you. And as you come in, are you still using that same kind of behavior? Well, traditional technology just doesn't provide you that. We're going to need artificial intelligence to help us understand, is that really you at the other end of the line or not, without a person ever having to interact with it. So, we're looking at it from both perspectives of how can I better protect my company, and also how can I better protect my customers as they're coming in the front door. Because if you think about the risks that we have, one obviously is if we're attacked externally and there is a breach, there's obviously, we're going to be on the front page of the paper. That's a bad thing. But from a customer perspective, if there is an account takeover and a customer's credentials have been compromised, there's fraud, right? There's dollar losses that goes along with that. So we're looking at it from both perspectives to help protect the customer and the company.
So let's go to the human element. What are you doing to protect both your employees and your customers to help them be safe and to be part of this defense ecosystem?
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we are partners with an organization called the National Cybersecurity Alliance. So they are the governing body around National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we leverage traditional media, emailing our customers, emailing our employees about, especially in October, but throughout the year, of what are the threats that they could be facing, because a lot of it does go back to education and sometimes ignorance of, oh, well, my bank just emailed me that my password was compromised and I need to click this link to go reset my password, right? Well, we would never do that. So we literally sent an email to every one of our customers about a month and a half ago about, okay, we are also never going to call you to do this type of transaction, because again, we saw a threat and we needed to do the education. From an employee standpoint, a company's, at least from our perspective, still the number one risk that we have is phishing. Phishing is the number one way, still, it's been a long time, but still it's the number one way that companies are compromised. And when I say compromised, that means an employee got a phishing email, they clicked on that link, and the malware or the malicious software that was behind that link was then installed on that computer, and then it goes out throughout the network. So we do testing every single month. I've got a few folks from my team here, and I even test my own team, but literally every person in the company, including our CEO, is tested every single month with a fake phish, and we actually track metrics around the percentage of those that click. And our CEO has even taken it to a whole nother level with his leadership team and has said if any one of his leaders clicks a link, their first click costs them $2,000.
Wow.
Their second click, now this
We
is
will not be implementing that here, by the way.
I'm not done yet. Their second click cost them $5,000, and if they click 3 times, and again, these are the campaigns that my team runs, it's $10,000.
Wow.
Pardon? Well, that actually comes right off of their bonus. Well, it doesn't get rolled into a budget, it's actually not paid out to them.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, we've got a lot of questions here. I have one last question for you, then we're going to get into the questions, which is what we refer to here as the lightning round. So the question I want to ask the 3 of you to answer very briefly, if you could, is what keeps you up at night?
Go first.
Yep.
It's definitely the death by 1,000 cuts, 10,000 cuts, whatever it is. My organization has 300,000 employees, and on any given day, they're making decisions about, do I click on the link of this email, or do I sign this contract, or do I okay this link to this outside vendor, or do I give this person access? So it goes back to what all of us, I think, have talked a little bit about culture, just getting to that awareness stage where people make good decisions.
Very good. Bill?
I think I might say a different version of partnership. I sit at a large company that's been around really for 50 years, and they have a tremendous presence across the entire government, and I sense as a new person coming in a fresh set of eyes, and I think that this is something that we should all be wary of, is a sense of complacency. We're very good at what we do. We have all the answers to the problems and no recognition that there's a lot of people on the other side of this equation working very hard to undermine our security posture and the securities that we are to guarantee to the, in our case, the federal government. And so trying to drive meaningful partnership with different institutions and even industry to industry around better ways of solving these kinds of problems. It's not a natural inclination because you don't want to share revenue or you don't want to waste time, you're too busy, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's driving partnership, and it kind of comes with the job I'm in today.
Keith?
I think it's a couple of things. One, I'm very protective of my team. And we all work a lot of hours, and it's the unknown unknowns of we've got to be right 100% of the time, whereas the bad guys only got to be right once. And sometimes when we get in stages, which these past couple months have been pretty rigorous with the increased amount of attack traffic that we've been seeing, and fatigue sometimes is a challenge. And if I look back across a lot of the major breaches, it came back down to, in many cases, a single alert was sent in and somebody didn't see it.
Wow.
Right?
Yep.
It's countless times when that happens. So how do I keep my team alert, fresh? When I say my team, it can also be the entire company. It does get back to the human element of most of the time, technology is not going to fail you because it's programmed to do something the same way every single time, but people are not.
Okay, you ready for the lightning round? Here we go, a lot of questions. On the topic of culture, speak to the greatest challenges you have faced in shifting from a more traditional mindset to one that can attract and retain millennial talent in cybersecurity.
Well, I know for one, just like I was actually talking with my team today, we have a current cornhole tournament going on my floor. I'm actually serious. No, we're very deliberate about culture at Ally, and it's not one where it's overbearing, but depending upon the day, you may see me walking around with a box of Twizzlers, throwing them at my team. It's all around accessibility, feeling like the team they're making an impact on what they're doing, and that they feel empowered to go do their job.
Any other comments on culture with regard to millennials?
Yeah, I think, my experience at the Pentagon, which is where I spent the last 3 years, was I spent probably most of my time actually educating senior leadership bringing them to the awareness of the challenges in front of them, which was, for all intents and purposes, another domain of warfighting, the cyberspace or the cyber operations domain. And it was, very much trying to push forward the young, the millennials as they came in, because they were digital natives and felt very comfortable operating in this environment. Then I had everybody in the middle, which was pretty much 80% of the workforce. So whatever you can do and wherever you sit to actually address that middle group, the ones who have not been trained for it, you're asking them to change and in some cases transform, to retrain and things of those natures. I believe that they're the biggest challenge in front of us.
Paul, anything you want to add?
I'm going to be purchasing a box of Twizzlers this weekend. I think that kind of thing is a great idea. We've also become a lot more flexible about things like work from home and remote workers and things to just accommodate a changing lifestyle. A big advantage we have is that our company is about taking care of people in hospital beds. So that's a mission that no matter what age group you are, people can connect to that. So we really focus a lot on helping people, whatever it is that they're working on, making sure that they can connect that back to somebody who's in a hospital bed. And someday that could be you, or it could be your mom. And it's a very motivating thing.
Healthcare and financial sectors are highly regulated industries. How do you find the balance of remaining compliant while also ensuring your organization is secure? As we have seen with recent breaches, simply because you're compliant does not mean you're secure. Healthcare,
Amen.
finance?
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, we at Ally, we are regulated by the Federal Reserve, and they have oversight over everything that I do. And they are actually beginning an exam on my team in about 3 weeks. But to your point, the Federal Reserve, they don't have the level of technical expertise that my team does. They're looking at it from, okay, here's the policy, do you adhere to the policy? But they're not in the fight every single day like we are. So it's my responsibility to always be looking out into the future, like cloud as an example. As we move stuff to the cloud, how can I be confident that everything that we're doing meets the requirements of a cloud security program? The regulators are not going to be looking at it in that same way. So it's beholden upon us as information security leaders to think well beyond what regulators think about. That's just my perspective.
Paul?
Absolutely agree. Very, very much the same approach. And in the healthcare, the regulations really are focused more on patient safety. And in recent years, it's with HIPAA and high tech, it's spread to privacy and information security. But our view is it's sort of the minimum. You've got to go way beyond that to really protect yourself and use it to your advantage. Have a culture where people know they have to be compliant and make sure that privacy, information security, cybersecurity, it's all part of that mindset.
Small and mid-sized businesses do not have umbrella organizations to lean on for support. How should small and mid-sized businesses try to replicate the support structures that exist between large organizations and their subsidiaries? And if so, how?
I think there's certainly in industry writ large, there is a collaboration that has to take place. I'll use my company as an example. We have over 10,000 suppliers, and the Department of Defense recently signed a regulatory guidance that holds the large service integrators to the primes of various government contracts responsible for the tiering that takes place to second, third, and even fourth tier level providers of the equipment and the various components that we use. And so there's a tremendous effort underway, at least across the Department of Defense and all the providers and supporters of their missions, to actually collaborate in a way that can begin the process of those who are maybe under-resourced, under-trained, and haven't been doing business in that fashion to actually pull them up into a larger discussion around how do we work together to make sure that we're providing security.
I think it also gets back to small and medium-sized businesses can't just hide under a rock and think it doesn't affect them. And it's going to cost money to do that. There has to be dollars, even though they may be small. There are, use the word service providers, there are service providers out there that do security for a living. And they do it for many companies at a time, but they just may do it at a much different scale. So it's not difficult for medium-sized businesses to go outsource some security services, even like a security operations center, which is something that all of us have as a part of our organizations, but there's no way a medium-sized business could afford it. But you can outsource that. Maybe they're sitting in India and they're virtual, but at least someone is there watching. So I think it's important to make sure that there is some investment that's tied to security.
Paul, this one's for you. At HCA, is your security guidance a mandate across your 180 plus facilities, or do they have independence adopting or ignoring your guidance at their discretion? I think it came from one of your team members.
The word mandate is kind of strong, but we definitely set policies and standards that everyone needs to follow. But we have to allow, again, at the end of the day, we're about healthcare. We're not about security. Security needs to be part of it, but if our operators, if our nurses, if our doctors feel like there's something different, some nuance that's local, we certainly have to be open to that. So I hesitate to use the word mandate, but yes, as much as we can consistently approach things one way, that's definitely the way we want to do it.
So whoever wants to pick up this ball, how do you influence small and mid-sized business leaders, CIOs, et cetera, to invest in cybersecurity when they don't feel like they are as targeted as much as a large company? We all know that once a data breach occurs, they will have no choice. So how do you convince them before the breach?
Read the paper?
Yeah, exactly.
Any other insight? Read the paper.
Well, I don't think I would
paper.
agree with that statement that they're not as targeted. I do think big organizations
They don't
just
feel like they're as targeted.
Yeah, okay.
It's the perception that I think the question is getting at, the false perception.
Yeah, and I think also one thing they've got to take into account is the impact that a breach has on a small organization is so magnified. I mean, there's so many organizations that they literally go out of business as a result of a cyber incident. So it's, going back to what was said on the previous question, collaboration is something that, you have to spend some money, but you've also got to think about just how do you collaborate. I don't feel like I don't look at other hospital companies, for example, as competitors when it comes to cybersecurity. If we find something new and scary and unique, we're on the phone to Vanderbilt, we're on the phone to Baylor, we're on the phone to Community Health. We're all sharing, and I think small and medium-sized businesses need to establish those kinds of networks as well.
And I would also add that to the point about what I was talking about, regulatory guidance on the primes, that actually started at the White House and came down through the department, and it will, over time, I think, cascade across all governments, state and local, because it's critical that we get this right. It is a absolutely weakness in our way of life, and in some ways, depending on how you play the story forward. And so at Leidos, as one example, we are incentivizing our supplier network. By the time you get down to a fourth tier supplier, you have somebody maybe making components that go into hardware someplace, and they really operate in a mom and pop shop fashion with sort of Windows 98 and complete access and open access to the internet. That's how they do business. And so we're incentivizing really in our role as prime not to cover ourselves so much as to work together collaboratively to fix the problem. And I think that increasingly organizations at every level are working together within their sphere of influence to actually affect meaningful change in this area.
So in the last 5 minutes of our time together, so we're going to pick up the pace a little bit here. What major cyber changes have taken place nationwide since the incident in Atlanta in the government, healthcare centers, and private sectors? So the last year, what's new?
I think one of the things from just an overall industry standpoint, there have been more standards that have been put in place to help companies understand. There's something called the NIST cybersecurity framework. And there are others that are out there that have been, it's not just in the last year, but in the last few years that have come to light to help us all understand what are the baseline requirements that you need to have in place. It doesn't matter what size company you are. Here are all the controls that exist. And how can we all help each other? Like healthcare, financial services the same way. We're interacting very closely together to help ensure that all boats rise with the tide.
One area that I think has changed significantly in the last year is the so-called trade war with China. Not to at all politicize the discussion, but I think there's two parts to that. One has to do with trade imbalances and getting a fair shake and all of that, but the far more important one from my perspective is taking on the Chinese infiltration of our networks, and there have been just clear messages sent that we're not going to step back from that. So getting serious with a sort of a near-peer competitor of ours, both in national security terms but also economic viability, is critically important for the country, and I think it's something that is the right thing to do.
How about if one of you pick up this question, please tell us about your relationship with second-line partners such as IT compliance and IT risk management.
We have several that we use. We have companies that, for example, we have retainer agreements for forensics firms that if we have something that we're concerned that we need to investigate, we can quickly pull them in. We work through our internal audit group and work with outside firms that come in and provide an outside view of how our program compares with others. And we use the NIST cybersecurity framework to measure ourselves. So I don't know if I'm going exactly down the path of the question, but we do depend quite a bit on outside firms, not only for specific expertise, but also just that outside perspective is really valuable.
How about if one or two of you pick up this question? At the corporate boardroom level, how do you overcome the perception of security as an overhead cost with respect to corporate revenue?
So for 3 years as the Chief Information Officer, I worked to get into the so-called C-suite to basically talk to my leadership about the importance of it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, education was critical to leadership that was far more comfortable talking about the next possible air war in the case of the Air Force, and I would say it might not matter because, and then we'd have a conversation around the cyberspace domain. So getting their attention on a changed environment was critical.
It's all about education. Educating the board that the threat's real, that the threats we are facing those threats every single day, and that it can't be something that we just do because we have to.
The business in most verticals look at cybersecurity as a black hole and a barrier to get work done. What are your methods and ways in relationship to reflect that you are there not to hinder, but to support and innovate alongside them?
I've built a whole team around that. Generally in the industry, it's called the Business Information Security Officer, but I own risk too, so it's a Business Risk and Security Officer. I have one of them here from that team here today, but it's all around enabling the business within the bounds of our policies, baselines, and standards, ensuring that what they're doing is secure, but yet helping them be creative and innovative in some cases to ensure that they're getting the work out.
Something I did very purposefully, again as the CIO, was I took the Chief Information Security Office out and separated it out so that there was a healthy tension between those who worried about risk and those who were really responsible for providing the infrastructure to get the mission done. And it created a healthy tension, but very purposefully around that issue there.
We did that as well. The one other thing that I would add is that we looked internally in our group first and said, what is our approach and what is our attitude toward the business? And let's make sure that we're focused, as you said, you built your team around that idea of enabling, and then took that out and tried to make that the way that we work together with all elements of the business.
So last question, we're just out of time here. Maybe a fun, not a very fun ending question, depends. Have any of you ever had to take away technology from a very important person, let's say like the president? I want to hear the answer to this.
The story takes too long, but like on his third day of office, I was given 15 minutes to meet with Bill Clinton and convince him to give up his personal cell phone. And it was actually a great lesson learned because there was like a betting pool in the office of how many minutes I would last till I got thrown out. And he actually shocked me and took it out of his pocket and said, "You're right." And he said, you know, all of us, he said, in this job, I'm going to get hit by 1,000 things a day, and I'm not going to be the expert on all of them, and we've all got to do our part, and I've got to listen when people like you tell me things like this. So, but that was definitely a plant by Jim. Anyway.
Anyone else want to?
Never had to do that.
Well,
Bill?
we had responsibilities for both the larger Air Force District of Washington, all of the networks there, so you were servicing up and down the chain of command of every, because we had executive agency over all of the various services, and then a real clear nexus to the White House Communication Agency for both funding and supporting a lot of their communications requirements, and in both cases, some very high-end customers who really had to be 100% connected all of the time. So while I didn't have to take anything away, I sure did have to provide.
We could do this for another hour. You're very engaging. You're very experienced. Would you please join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you.